Cards. It was potentially the most sweeping welfare reform yet. The idea of a cashless card to replace a host of government payments was first raised in a review of Indigenous employment by mining magnate Andrew Forrest.
I've walked down the streets of certain towns in Australia where I've had young girls offer their entire bodies for a packet of cigarettes or even a cigarette. And this is where you've got massive social dislocation at the hands of cash-ridden welfare, having removed the social structure out of many vulnerable Australian communities.
While the timetable for the rollout has not been set, the government has confirmed its commitment to a trial in a small number of communities. The welfare card would apply to both Aboriginal and non-Indigenous welfare recipients and allow access to a small amount of cash, but it would specifically restrict the purchase of alcohol. In the East Kimberley region of far northwestern Australia, Indigenous leaders have been considering the proposed welfare changes and they've signalled qualified support, but with a caveat that support programs and safeguards are implemented at the same time. Ginny Stein travelled to the remote town of Kununurra for this report.
It's NAIDOC week and the kids of Kununurra are getting their groove on at a disco run by international aid agency Save the Children. It raises the question just why an international agency known more for its work in failed states or war zones is here.
It's really important for these kids to get home because it's late and kids on the street we don't know what's dangerous out there, you know?
There was a time when families were distrustful of the agency's presence. Now it's welcomed. Why is the bus good?
Because it's like
good for dropping off kids.
Good for dropping off kids, and like people might be murdering all the little kids if they're walking around the streets.
Save the Children started up its night patrol just a few years ago.
Okay, everybody put your belts on.
Despite the work of the agency, these kids still face real dangers, and it can be in their own homes.
Some kids are made to go home because either they're drunk back home and they feel unsafe.
The grim reality is that alcohol abuse and domestic violence are ongoing problems for these kids.
Some of if their parents are drunk, they usually come to the street and meet their friends. So if they're frightened to go home, their friends will take them back to their house.
It's a beautiful town, but it's falling down. It's not something not right here.
A single father of 3 young kids, Michael Beebe does not drink and never has. His marriage broke up over alcohol. He took me to this drinking ground on the town's outskirts. It's quiet now, but the town fills up as the wet season approaches. This stuff, what's this?
This is poker face, really cheap wine, only for $7.
And a plastic bottle to boot. And there are others who are deeply concerned about the impact of alcohol.
So what we're trying to do is
For decades, Ian Trust has watched families fall apart in Kununurra.
in cutting back on alcohol use. I mean, we're not saying that people shouldn't drink at all, but it's got to be done in a responsible manner. There's more kids now in care than there ever was during the Stolen Generation era, and we just want to do something that's going to make a difference.
He's been pushing welfare reform for years and believes the key is intervention in the form of a welfare debit card that bans alcohol being bought while limiting access to cash. And now it seems he has government backing.
I sort of come to the conclusion that unless we come in with some sort of an interventionist reform agenda, especially around welfare, nothing's going to change.
In recent weeks, Aboriginal elders have met in the East Kimberley to consider the government's proposal.
It's also for white people as well, and also we also want to. The flip side of all this, of course, in terms of the reform agenda, the welfare reform agenda, is also having incentives such as more housing, better quality education, jobs or traineeships and so on that people can, you know, be attracted to once they're starting to change their lives around.
Across the East Kimberley, there is strong support amongst the Aboriginal leadership for the card to be trialled here. But they're asking the federal government to ensure that Aboriginal people at a local level have a real role in both administering the card and determining how much each individual is allowed in cash. The proposed debit card will target what can and cannot be bought. Alcohol will be blocked.
We've got a single objective with the Healthy Welfare Card, and that is to address the welfare-fuelled alcohol and drug abuse, which is rife in some communities. Now, I know, Ginny, you've been speaking to some of the leaders in Kununurra. In a place like Kununurra, the hospitalisation rates from assaults is 68 times the national average. Much of that is due to alcohol, much of which is paid for by the welfare dollar.
It was mining magnate Andrew Forrest who first mooted the cashless card. But he warns it can only work if support programs are also rolled out.
When you bring in the debit card, which will restrict alcohol and illicit drug consumption very dramatically, then do not do it in isolation. Make sure you've got a much greater counselling presence, much greater services to people who will feel dislocated, from young boys and girls to old men and women.
Wherever the card is trialled, it will target the entire community, and the card won't be entirely cashless.
This time it's being driven, or particularly here, it's being driven by the Aboriginal leadership. And that's a good thing because it's not being driven by anybody else. They're asking for change. I think there'll be a few issues, but I can't see that they're insurmountable.
While the government has held talks with the Aboriginal leadership, the next step will be getting the message to the community and those whose lives will be affected by the proposed changes. Ian Truss knows this isn't going to be easy. He also knows there'll be some who blame him for the changes.
I'm 64 years of age and I'm sort of past the point of wanting to be popular to everybody.
Michael Beebe feels he too will be blamed, but he says he's already been isolated by his family and the community because he does not drink.
Yes, they're not going to be popular. They're going to run us down. To stand up now, you won't be a popular person, which is bad because you're in your community and all the community want to do is drink.
Michael Beebe knows alcohol creates terrible problems. In his case, the community's obsession with alcohol has even made him wary of buying a car.
This is funny. This is a weird situation here. We're terrified to get a car because they'll come and humbug us, telling us to go to the drive-in, and so we're trying to have the good things here, which we're terrified to get.
For many in this town crying out for change, it remains a waiting game. The government is yet to announce either where or when these extreme measures will be rolled out.
Well, Alan Tudge is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. He's a key advocate within the federal government for the proposal to trial a cashless card. He joins us now from Melbourne. Thanks for being there.
G'day, Tony.
Now, can you tell us whether this card will in fact be trialled in the East Kimberley region, which includes Kununurra, which we just saw, but also Halls Creek and Fitzroy Crossing, as well as remote communities?
Tony, we haven't announced the location of the trials just yet, but we're clearly in advanced discussions with some of the East Kimberley leaders. Overall, we said right at the outset that we'd like to trial this cashless debit card idea in locations which satisfy two criteria, one being that there is high welfare-fuelled alcohol abuse, and secondly, where there's at least an openness from community leaders to consider that trial, and Kununurra may well fit that criteria. Yeah,
we have seen key Indigenous leaders get behind it. We just saw Ian Truss there. I mean, how important is it to have someone like him, obviously, behind it, but with caveats?
I think it's immensely important for someone of Ian Trust's calibre to be backing it and be calling for it. I mean, Ian's now one of the most substantial Indigenous leaders in the country, and when he's standing up and asking for reform, then I think that governments should listen, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Now, do you regard this as an extension of the intervention?
I don't, Tony. There's significant differences from what we've done in the intervention versus what we're proposing here. Here is quite a straightforward concept. It is to provide welfare instead of exclusively in cash, to instead provide most of the welfare into an account which can only be accessed through a Visa or a EFTPOS debit card, which will work everywhere. You can purchase whatever you like with that card, but it will simply restrict the purchase of alcohol and gambling products, and because your cash is limited, you won't be able to purchase illicit drugs either.
So one of the lessons, I suppose, which one could learn from the intervention was cooperation and consultation with the community. Is that one of the other key differences in the way you're handling this?
Well, certainly the intervention was a particular time. It was responding to an emergency situation. Now, in this instance, we've got the benefit of more time, and certainly we are very deeply engaging with the various communities where we may be trialling it, and indeed the community leaders in a place like Kununurra are shaping what the trial will look like, shaping how the card will look like, what its parameters are, how it might be rolled out. And I think if we do it that way, we've got a much greater chance of having a successful trial.
How can you avoid the perception nationally that this is not a sort of racially targeted policy?
Well, it's not, and every person within a defined geographical area that is on an income support payment will be captured by it, and that's Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. And while the East Kimberley has a higher proportion of Aboriginal people there, in other areas where we're having advanced discussions with, the welfare community is more like 50% Indigenous, 50% non-Indigenous. So it's very much a colour-blind card. That was always the intent, and as it should be.
So are you talking possibly about trial sites in major cities, in the suburbs which have high concentrations of welfare recipients?
Not necessarily major cities, but certainly some regional towns where we've had advanced discussions with. We're not in the position yet to announce the other areas where we're likely to have a trial, but we're certainly having good consultations there. We want to ensure that there is that ownership on the ground before we have a trial commence.
Okay, now let's go back to Kununurra and East Kimberley for a minute. There are complexities to this, obviously. As we saw from that piece, the things get a lot worse during the wet season when people come from remote communities and they come into the towns, many times living in and around the towns in camps, and the alcohol problem becomes a lot worse at those times. Now, is there a way of making sure that all of the people coming in to the town also are under the same regime?
It's a very difficult problem to solve that, and I've been having deep conversations with the community leaders in Kununurra about that precise thing, and we're trying to work through a solution, but I don't think we have one just yet. But we've still got some time to try to be creative in relation to this problem.
And there's an obvious question too about what support there would need to be under these circumstances. Lots of people reliant on alcohol addicts, I suppose you could say, alcoholics. Kununurra has a sobering up centre, but it doesn't have an alcohol treatment centre. I mean, are things like that going to have to change in order to deal with the fact that you're stopping people from buying alcohol effectively?
Yeah, we're very conscious of this point which you make, and certainly once we decide where a trial will occur, we'll be having discussions with the service providers on the ground to ensure that there is appropriate capacity to deal with some of those issues. And it's not just things like alcohol counselling which might be required, but it's also things like budgeting assistance or financial management assistance and other types of services which people may need under this situation.
We're nearly out of time, but how quickly could we see this happen? How quickly could the trial sites be rolled out, and are you ready to actually distribute cards, more or less?
Well, ideally, we'd begin this trial early next year. That's certainly our aim, and that's the timeline we're working towards.
And the idea beyond that, to, if it works in those trial sites, to roll it out nationally?
The intent is not to roll it out across Australia, but rather the intent is to have a trial, to evaluate it, learn from it, and then to possibly apply it selectively in high welfare communities. But let's get to that stage after we've done the trial, after we've done the evaluation and received the lessons from it.
Alan Tudge, fascinating thoughts there. Interesting to see how this works. We'll look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks so much, Tony.